Okay, so this video is for AGB312, the Ag Policy class, and the objective of this video is to give you a kind of a quick rundown of how externalities work graphically. Okay, so first of all, we want to just have a quick review of what is the definition of an externality. So generally speaking, the definition of a negative externality, because there's also positive externalities, the definition of a negative externality is when some of the costs generated by a market transaction between two parties are imposed on another party that is not part of the transaction. So the basic idea is like you have people involved in a market transaction, someone provides a good, the other person buys that good at an agreed upon price, but as a result of that transaction, there's some third party, some other person that's not part of the formal transaction that's impacted, and generally impacted in a negative way. Okay, so let's look through the idea of a negative externality with an example. So let's look at dorm space at Cal Poly. Okay, the university provides dorm space. They build dorms, and students transact with the university. They pay fees to live in the dorms. So the idea is the university says we have to cover our costs. Here's the price. Students say, okay, it's worth it. So we would have the supply curve. Remember, the supply curve is the same as the marginal cost curve, okay? So, and we have a P here for private, just that it's a private, even though the university is a state entity, it's still a private transaction. So the university has its marginal cost curve indicating at different levels of output, what does it cost to produce another, let's say, square foot of dorm space. So the cost curve, the marginal cost curve, incorporates all the costs of the university, materials, administrative costs, etc. The demand curve represents the needs or desires of the students. So remember, the idea of a demand curve is also a marginal willingness to pay. So students will look at that dorm space and, theoretically speaking, say, this is what I'm willing to pay. And in determining that willingness to pay, they're incorporating all the good things and bad things about the dorm. So there's not living in the dorm is not always a great thing, but when someone decides that is the price worth paying, they take that into account. Okay? So now in a normal market, let's say a normal dorm market, what you would have theoretically is you'd have an equilibrium. So there's some equilibrium price and some equilibrium quantity. So the university could generate more dorm space, but the problem is it gets more and more expensive to generate more dorms, and they would need a higher price to provide that dorm space. But as the price goes up, there's less demand for that dorm space from the university on the part of students. Okay? So again, this idea of equilibrium market's clear. So what I'm describing is a situation where there are no externalities. So all the costs are borne by the university in terms of construction, and theoretically the students take into account the negative side, let's say noise, it's kind of gross, it's messy, whatever. That's kind of the life of living in the dorm, I guess. But they take that into account. So everyone involved in the transaction is absorbing all the costs and benefits. There's no leakage per se. No one else is affected. Okay? So now let's kind of change the situation a little bit. As you may know, the university is considering building new dorms in the parking lot near the PAC. So you've got this great space. The university has said, as far as we're concerned, this is the best place to build the dorms. It's convenient to food service, students can park, etc., etc. To go anywhere else would be more expensive. And as for the students are probably going to be okay with the location of that dorm. And in fact, if the location is not any good, they just will not involve themselves in the transaction. They'll say, I'm not going to live there. I'll live somewhere else. So they're not suffering by not living in the dorms. So again, just describing again that private market transaction. But the problem is that there are going to be neighbors next to that new dorm. Okay? So these neighbors are going to they're really not involved in the transaction. The university doesn't seem to be changing any of its plans to take into account the concerns of the neighbors of the university. So how do we graph this idea of people being impacted by this transaction of building new dorms and students living in those dorms by people who are not part of that transaction? So what we would do is we would say, well, we would draw a line above this private marginal cost, okay? And we would be saying that represents the additional costs generated by the building and occupation of the dorms. So theoretically speaking, the university only has to pay the costs in its private marginal cost curve. The students are only responding to the price that's being accepted by the university. But we still have these neighbors who have, it's much noisier. They have to do a lot more cleaning up. There's a lot more traffic. So they're absorbing these costs for something that they're not part of the transaction. They can't leave, there's no transaction for them to leave. They're kind of stuck. They're stuck absorbing those costs. If you wanted to monetize those costs, you could say, if they wanted to get the noise level down to what it was before the dorms, they would have to build thicker walls, have double pane windows. They would actually be spending money to get things back to where they were. And so what you would see is that the difference between, and we're going to call this the marginal social cost. And the marginal social cost is determined by, so we're just taking one slice. So this is the marginal private cost. This is the external cost. So this, for this amount of output, for this amount of dorm space, this gap right here is the cost absorbed by the neighbors that the university is causing these costs to be absorbed, but they're not responsible for paying them. Okay? And then the sum of those costs are the marginal social costs, the marginal costs of society. So we're just summing the private costs and the external costs. Okay? So, again, definition of the externality. It's when there's a transaction between two parties, students and university, that generate costs being absorbed by a third party. So this is the neighbors. Okay? And again, it's all legal. There's nothing illegal about what's being done. It's just that the project is increasing costs on third parties who have no say in the transaction. So what do we end up with? Well, we showed what the equilibrium was for the students and the university. So we had a certain price and quantity. But if we said, realistically, if we're trying to optimize for the community, if we wanted to take into account all the costs of the dorm, we would say we would want to start incorporating these external costs into the decision to say what's the socially optimal amount of dorm space that there should be. And so what we would say is like, well, we're now looking at the intersection between the demand curve and the marginal social cost. So we're actually saying in determining how much dorm space we should have, we have to kind of combine what are the total benefits from the dorm and weigh them against the total cost, which includes these external costs. And so what we would see is that the price, I'll say externality, quantity of externality, what we should see is that we should actually have fewer dorms at a higher price, because it's at this point that we're saying if the marginal benefit of an additional dorm is exactly equal to whatever the additional cost generated by that additional dorm space. So that additional cost would include not just the cost of construction, administration, etc., but also the costs absorbed by the neighbors. So we have a difference between what the market would generate, PE and QE, versus the socially optimal idea, which says we have to take into account those non-market costs and say we would expect a higher price and a lower cost.